Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this video in which I talk about basics of supply chain management. We'll begin with a simple question. What is a supply chain? And we will work from there. I'm planning on creating multiple videos in this series. Most of this will be based upon slides from the textbook. So, let's get started. So what is a supply chain, right? So supply chain includes all companies that are involved in the making of a particular good or service. Everything from maybe manufacturing companies to maybe even mining companies that make ore that is required to make a particular item. So everything going from the first time a particular raw material becomes available till the product gets to the customer, and these days return of the product or disposal of the product is also considered as part of the supply chain. So back in the day, we'd say that once the product reached the customer, that was the end of the supply chain, but that's not true. It's still the end of the product's life cycle, which is till the product gets either disposed or recycled into a new product. Right? So that is what a supply chain is. Every single company that's involved in doing this is part of that supply chain, right? And as I said, customer is an integral part of this supply chain, and these days it's more important to say that it's more like a web than a chain, and you'll see that. For example, here is an example of an automotive supply chain, right? So you have so many companies that are involved in making a car. Let's take a simple car. A car is being made, a sedan is being made, and all the parts that go into a sedan. You have some electronics parts, you have some mechanical parts. The mechanical parts are manufactured by somebody, or by the company itself, or sometimes they are bought from supplier companies. And so you have raw material suppliers, you have tier 2 suppliers, you have tier 1 suppliers. Then all of them come to an assembly plant where they get assembled, and then they go to the dealers and finally to the customers. And then finally the customers will either junk the car or will sell it back to the dealer. So the dealer is still part of this, used car dealer is part of the supply chain, or the customer will send it to a junkyard, in which case the junkyard also becomes part of the supply chain. So all of this is part of the supply chain, and that is what we mean by supply chain. Now, I know that I'm going on and on about this, but I wanted to get an idea that every single element, every single company that is involved, right from raw materials till disposal, is part of the supply chain, right? I'm sure you understand that by now. Okay. So what are the different things that flow in a supply chain? Because remember that when you look at a complex web like this, each of these boxes is a different company, right? So what are the things that flow from company to company, right? So let's take a simple example. Let's say that you're looking at supply chain for a cereal, right? You go to Walmart, you buy cereal, yeah, but that cereal came from, say, General Mills. Now, General Mills assemble the cereal, but General Mills also needs, say, cardboard boxes. Now, they might have multiple suppliers of cardboard boxes, not just one. Now, for General Mills to work better, to make sure that they are able to deliver cereal better to their customers, who are essentially places like Walmart, and we are not General Mills customer directly. We are General Mills customers through retail stores, right? So General Mills customers are the retail stores, sometimes even distributors. How do they make sure that they satisfy demand well or make the most amount of money? Well, they need to know some information from their customers, and they also need to know some information from their suppliers. If, for example, for whatever reason, suddenly the manufacture of paper is really difficult. If that happens, then manufacture of cardboard becomes difficult. If manufacture of cardboard becomes difficult, then the supply of cardboard might dwindle or might become more expensive, which in turn will have an effect on how much cereal can be made, how quickly it can be made, and how quickly it can be delivered to the retail store. So lots of fiddly moving bits in here, and it is important to keep track of. So General Mills has to keep track of its suppliers and has to keep track of its customers, right? And what are the things that flow? So money has to flow. Obviously, when you buy something or you sell something, you either pay or you get money. And then, of course, information and products. So funds is a single way, but product and information is a two-way flow. Now, funds can also be a two-way flow because, for example, if you send something, if the supplier sends you something, part of it is damaged, you send it back to the supplier, so there might be some give and take with funds. But in the end, you can think of funds as flowing a single way. But product will flow both ways. So will information. The information is the most important piece that flows within a supply chain, and it is important to understand that and to understand what kind of information flows. So if General Mills can get data about, say, cardboard shortages from the supplier, then they can sort of prepare for what is coming, right? So they might say, hey, this particular supplier is having a problem. Maybe we go talk to a different supplier, or maybe we order more from them right now because in the future they might not be able to supply as much as quickly, right? So, but as I said, there is inherently a risk to the supplier for giving that information over to General Mills. Why? If General Mills decides that this supplier is unreliable, they might go to a competitor, in which case this particular supplier is losing business. So information sharing is good, but sometimes companies are not so free with sharing information. But that's how supply chains operate. Now, the overall objective of a supply chain, what exactly are we trying to get out of a supply chain? Because remember that supply chain is just a meta concept. What exists in reality is just individual companies, and each company is trying to maximize its own profit. So when you look at a supply chain in total, right, what should the objective of a supply chain be? Because there is not one person who's looking at the whole supply chain, because any company that you might take, however vertically integrated, so that's a word we'll talk about more in the future, but however vertically integrated, which means that much of the manufacturing of a particular item happens within the company, even though they are vertically integrated, they will have suppliers at some level, right? There is no car company that is mining its own ore. They are buying ore for aluminum and all the other items that go into a car from a supplier. So at a certain level, there's always going to be a supplier, right? So how do you define the objective of a supply chain? Because there's no one person who's taking care of everything that happens to a particular product. Well, you look at it in terms of supply chain surplus, right? How much customer value was created? And then you subtract the supply chain cost from that. Now, this looks like a very simple equation, but it is figuring out how much customer value was generated, and even figuring out supply chain cost, not easy. We're going to spend the rest of the semester doing this, right? So that's the basic idea of a supply chain and what the objective of a supply chain is, right? Okay, and so here are a few examples. A customer purchases a humidifier for $60 from Home Depot, right? Now the supply chain incurs some costs. So the difference between $60 and all of that cost is essentially supply chain profitability. But if the customer pays $60 for a humidifier, is the value to the customer just $60? Now, this is a very, very important piece that you have to realize. If the customer really likes the humidifier, and the customer is somebody who needs a humidifier because they are susceptible to getting dry in their house, or their house is susceptible to get dry, so they need a humidifier. And in the future, if they need another humidifier, they'll come back to you. So the value that you have created to the customer might be more than just the sales price. Now, mathematically speaking, for us to sort of put some numbers to it, we will likely use the revenue as the number, as the value created for the customer, but that is not always true, right? And there's also the customer can resell it, the customer can send it back to the company at the end of the life cycle, in which case you might be able to recover some parts from it, like an electronic board or something that might last much longer than the lifetime of the rest of the parts, right? There are lots of different things that can happen. So the value might be more than just revenue, but here we'll just assume that it is revenue, right? So supply chain profitability is the total profit to be shared across all stages in the supply chain. So all the costs that go into supply chain, if you add them all up, they'll obviously be less than $60. Otherwise, the company selling the humidifier is incurring a loss. Assuming that they are a decent enough company not making a loss, all of that cost will add up to some number less than $60. Usually, for things like humidifiers, the profit margin tends to be around 30 to 40-ish%. So based upon that, say the cost of the humidifier will be somewhere around $40-ish, maybe even $30. right? Depending upon how good the supply chain is. Now, success should be measured by the total supply chain surplus and not the profits of an individual stage. And this is the new paradigm that global companies are shifting towards. If you are more customer centric, then you should be looking at the total value, total surplus created by the supply chain and not the individual stages within that supply chain. But that's not easy, right? Because there's not one person who can manage every stage within a supply chain. Right? So effective supply chain management involves management of supply chain assets and products, and very importantly, information and flows. Now, fund flows obviously is going to happen. I mean, money is going to get exchanged, but information flow is extremely important, and that is the sticking piece to most supply chains working efficiently, because companies don't like to share a lot of their internal proprietary information. Right? Now, there are some interesting examples of how supply chain decisions made companies really, really profitable, or Webvan folded in 2 years because their supply chain was not good. But I'm going to end this video here. We are going to talk in the next video. We're going to talk about the different views of supply chain. How do you view a supply chain, right? And what does it even mean to view a supply chain? We'll talk about all of that in the next video. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. And well, I'll see you all in the next video. Take care.